everybody. My name is Jim Oberholzer. I'm the CEO and Chief Technical Architect for Agile Technology Architects, and we're going to be discussing today securely deploying websites with your PHP server on IBMi. Now, a lot of people like to run the web servers on IBMi. It's probably one of the best server platforms I've ever worked in, certainly the most securable platform I've ever worked on, but oftentimes some people just aren't really sure how to accomplish what we need to do. More about me, I have a master's in software engineering, and I have the Common Certified Business Computing Professional Certification. The Common organization has come up with 2 new certifications. I happen to be one of the subject matter experts that helped to write it. So if you go out to Common and check that out. I've been in the business for 31 years, rising to the level of CIO at one point. I also help write all the certification exams for IBM in their Power Systems line of products, primarily aimed at the business partner community, but also many of the individuals out there that want to show their abilities on the system with respect to operations and administration as well. Agile provides some services that you can read there, and one of our primary services is Power Systems Infrastructure and Performance, which is where this particular topic lies under. So we'll talk about some IBMi web serving. We'll talk about configuring the Apache server for a bit. We'll talk a little bit about the work management for web serving, and this is one thing that most of the time when I get called in for performance review, this is the area where we spend the lion's share of our time. We'll talk a little bit about networking, and I'll warn you up front, the networking stuff is a little bit geeky, but it's important that you understand, at least from an introductory perspective, what's going on. We'll wrap up and go from there. One note, we won't be talking about anything specific to PHP because that information is covered in other presentations, so we won't spend any time with that here. So, there are 2 different servers available for IBMi to serve up applications. One is the WebSphere application server. The Express Edition ships with every instance of IBMi. You're licensed for it. You can go ahead and use it. That is the platform that if you were to write Java 2 or Enterprise Edition Java environment stuff for, that's the server you would primarily use. The second server is the Apache web server. And one thing of note there, Tomcat support, which was the Java container that was available for a while, has been removed as of 6.1. At v5.04 it's still there, but it's not supported any longer, so most folks don't choose to use it. It's been replaced by the integrated web application server, so if you do have Java applications aside from your PHP that you want to run, that's the right place to put it. The Zen server actually utilizes the Apache server to serve up all of its web pages, so the Apache server is where we're going to spend all of our time. So, the primary web server is Apache. It's a licensed program product, DG1. Now, at v7.01, that's 5770. At v6, it is a different number. At v5.04, it's 5722, I believe. So you can find on your distribution media, which we'll talk about in just a moment. The Apache that's sent out with v7.01 is actually a 2.2.11. Now, as of yesterday, 2.3.14 beta was out, and the Apache Server Foundation had 2.2.21 out. Now, you'll notice that IBM is a few notches behind distribution. That's because IBM very, very carefully tests every Apache update that comes through to make sure that it works the way that you expect all of your IBM software to work. The other secret that IBM doesn't talk about much is the number one contributor to the Apache open source code is, in fact, IBM. They have several people that do nothing but work on Apache, so they know it quite well. If you've got the Apache server on there, there are some PTF groups that you do need to have on your system. You can see the numbers there. That's 368 for V7 and 115 for V6 in the current levels as of, I believe, Monday, 10 and 22. Those tend to come come out about every other month. Having spoken with the folks in Rochester that are responsible for that, the only time that they'll come out with something more often is if there's a PCI requirement or a specific security hole that needs to be filled. Now, when you order the PTF group for HTTP serving, you will get the Java group automatically, and it's 572 or 562 depending on your OS level, and you must install both of them at the same time, simply because there's too many ties between the two. So if you're ordering PTF groups, you may know that if you order a cumulative, that includes the hyper and the database. If you order the HTTP, you're getting the Java right along with it. So you can cut down how much stuff you have to order and how much download time you have. The odds are pretty strong that DG1 is installed in your system, and V701, it's just the base version. The triggered cache manager isn't included anymore. And if you need to, you can find it on the B Group 04 DVD. The V601, it's on the B2902 CD, and oftentimes people are confused as to where to find it, so I documented it here for you. Java is required along with the Apache, and this is where we start to run into some of the more interesting parts of Java. My fervent suggestion is if you install Java JV1, 5761 JV1, add V7, I strongly suggest you install all of the options, and I list them there. It's 8, 9, 11, 12, and 13. Option 10 is used at V5R4 to bring the 32-bit capability to V5R4, which is why it's not here. Option 8, which is the 32-bit Java machine, is really the one you want to use. The 64-bit is extremely good, does really, really well, but it does use way more memory, and the 32-bit has been optimized so that it runs extremely well. Now, the Zen server requires your Apache server, but it also requires several other pieces of software. The PACE environment, the Portable Application Solutions environment, that's effectively AIX, if you will, under the covers inside IBMi. You need QShell, you need the portable utilities, and some of the other utilities there, such as SSH, SST, and the ZLab. That's because the Zen server utilizes that software as it's doing its thing. Now, it's pretty rare to find an IBMi system that doesn't have most of this stuff installed. But every now and then I do run into places where it's not all there, so I encourage you to make sure that you check your system to make sure it's there. Now, for these 4 products, there aren't specific PTF groups that are available, and as of yesterday when I checked the registered knowledge base, there weren't any specific PTFs out for them. Most of those are buried into the cumulative group that you get roughly every 3 to 5 months. So let's move on to IBMi web configuration. The default IBMi admin web instance runs on port 2001, so if you want to get to it, you just do HTTP to your server address at port 2001. That will come up with the screen that I've presented here. And in order to get into the HTTP configurations, they've put those options underneath Internet Configurations over on the left-hand side there. If you press Internet Configurations, you'll get another panel that'll come up. It'll show the Internet Configurations, and the top one is the Web Administrator for I. That allows you to manage all the HTTP servers. Now, if you do have digital certificates, you can go into the Digital Certificate Manager right there and manage it. It's all quite easy, and it's an excellent interface. By the way, you'll notice that the left side of the screen, when you look at the laundry list of things that are there underneath IBM Management, looks and feels and tastes an awful lot like SystemI Navigator. That's because this is really the replacement for SystemI Navigator in the long run. This software here is where they're migrating all of that functionality to. If there's changes or updates, they go here first, and then they get into Navigator later. The only part of Navigator that's probably not going to be converted over to this is some of the database functions that require Windows-based services that they just can't put up the graphics without those Windows-based services. So most of it is here. Very small sliver in the databases is not. So I encourage you to start using the web configuration interface as opposed to SystemI Navigator. Alternatively, if you want to get into the IBM Tasks page, this is the URL that they put out there so that you can get into the more traditional one. If you're at V5R4, this is what you're going to see. If you're at 6.1 or 7.1, you'll get the Systems Director Navigator for High interface. And again, the more traditional interface is the IBM Web Administration. You can see that boxed in yellow there. So once we get into this, the first thing you're going to see is a panel that looks very similar to this, where you can either create servers, manage them. There's some advanced functions you can do, and then you can get at some related information. Here, you either want to create a new HTTP server, or if you've run the Zend install, the HTTP server for the Zend products is already there for and primarily configured for you. That's the one we're going to play with as we move forward here. So what we really want to do then is select the Manage tab that's at the top. That'll bring up a list of all your servers that are running on your system. Now, if you look on this panel, this is the system that I use. You'll note that my partner and I own a company named iDev Cloud, where we provide access to individual developers to do research and learning and that sort of thing. This system is actually running the iDev Cloud website. The primary website that we use then is running on port 80, which is the normal port for web serving. You'll note that the Zen server is also there on port 10,088. So this is the place where you can manage all of your servers. Now, each of the server names has a hyperlink on it, so if you click on that, then you'll go straight to the management of that server. Here's the panel that will come up. So you can see that it is the iDev Cloud Apache instance, and on the left-hand side there, right down the middle of the screen, left-hand side of the panel, you can see there are all kinds of options that you can get into with respect to managing this specific website. Now, also note that I have changed where the document root is. I actually run my websites under a directory called user local and then the name of the site. And then from there, the directory structure is exactly the same as it would be anywhere else. Very likely yours are under www/zenserver and then the htdocs and whatnot. Where the website is actually running from inside the IFS is really immaterial. What is important is that this is set up for the document root properly. If it's not, it won't find the appropriate documents necessary to put it up. Notice that down toward the bottom you have in the tools, you have display configuration file or edit it. I like to edit the configuration file from here rather than using the green screen edit function, because quite frankly the green screen edit function is just not that robust. You don't have copy paste, you don't have a number of the other functions that you can use. Alternatively, if you do have SSH running on your system and you know how to do this, you can install VI or VIM in your PACE environment and then just use PuTTY to get into your configuration files and manage them, and I do that quite a bit as well. So those of you who may have a Linux background, that might be a great alternative for managing things. The default location for the Zen server, as I mentioned before, is www/zenserver, and when Zend installs everything, it just goes in and it works. It's done properly. So the directories for the configuration are all down in htdocs, and then they also have a place for all your logs. You'll note that I have another directory there called save. That's where whenever I'm making changes, I'll always copy everything into save first, then make the changes. In the event that I need to, I can pull it back from save back into either the conf or htdocs directories to replace what I just did. Saves are your friend. Just remember to back up everything before you go ahead and make any changes. There is a question that says, can you tell me AutoStart will allow the HTTP instances after IPL? The answer to that question is generally yes. If your subsystem is started, the system will automatically start your servers. However, if you go back to this screen here, there is a place there to set whether or not it starts automatically at startup or not. It's not specifically on this screen, but if you get up there in the general server configuration, you can find it in there. So, we know that the Zen server is installed in www.zenserver, and that works extremely well for a production environment. But what about development? Most of you have developers in your staff that everybody wants to go ahead and have their own place to work. So my way of handling that is to create directories under /home/user profile so that you can put all of your development environment in there. So here's the premise. Each developer will have their own library, directory, and web address to do their own development. Now you can put security on top of these. I like to do that. I like to make sure that the developers can't intercede in each other's directories. It just makes life simpler in the long run. The other thing is you can run production on port 80 and port 443, which is the HTTP and HTTPS ports, and you can run a test version of the instance on the Zen default port, which is 10,088. And then life test tends to be real nice. You can have things all separated out. Now, one of the questions I get quite a bit is, well, can't I run 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 copies of the Zen server? And the answer is, well, not really. Zen doesn't at this time support running multiple copies of the Zen server, and the reasons for that are very valid and beyond the scope of this session, but just let's suffice it to say that some of the memory management techniques to make the server very, very efficient also preclude it from having multiple copies running at the same time. Now, I've put it on a very lightly loaded system and made it work, but not advised for production work. So the site at 10,088 will be integration testing in my environment here, where each developer has their own environment. URL, DNS, and all that stuff are set up on those servers properly, and we're also presuming that your firewalls are set up to allow access to the various different places correctly. So, step 1 is to create the base configuration. So each developer needs a home directory, so you create home, and then I've got an example here, iuser001. Then one of the things that you need to make sure is that the QTM HHTP1 and QTM HHTP user profiles have access to those directory structures. Now, in this particular case, I've given them all access. They have access to all the object authorities. In the case of production, I wouldn't give them quite that much authority. Also notice in this case I've got public exclude, which means for iuser007, which is the one that this picture is for, nobody else can get into that directory and mess with that website except for that user. That is, of course, unless you have all object authority. But we're presuming that most of you do not have all object authority on your user profile. Next step then is to copy the htdocs directly that Zen provides you directly into the appropriate directory inside your developers area. I also like to include the DB2 SQL example. PHP info. .php is particularly nice to have in place in case you want to see if anything's been changed in PHP. And it's such a simple piece of PHP code that it also checks to make sure that the server is running. Now, the .htt access file is particularly important. It does an awful lot of Apache rewrite, and it's required for the Zen routing to work. And if you're using the Zen framework, this is also where you set your environment when it gets around to doing all of its front-end loading and whatnot. So this particular file is particularly important, if you're really interested in what all the rewrites that are going on in there are, you can go out to the web and find the information, but I guarantee it will overwhelm you. There is so much information out there on Apache Rewrite that, to be perfectly honest, I allow our friends at Zen to figure out what the best solution is there and just copy it and try not to understand it too much. For those of you who are control language programmers, here's an example program that I use to create users on the IDEF Cloud box. Basically what it does is it creates the library, it creates a directory, copies all of the appropriate objects from the directory in there, and sets all the authorities, creates the user, and away we go. Now, this particular piece of code has no error handling or anything else. If you're really interested in the full program, give me a shout, and I'd be more than willing to share that for you. So now we go back to the Apache setup. The HTTPD.conf holds the Apache configuration, so you can get in there with Systems Director Navigator for IBMi. It's the same as I showed you before. And please forgive the uppercase I there. Microsoft is always trying to do us a favor by uppercasing things, even when we don't want it there. So if you want to get directly to the HTTP administration, you can see the URL down at the bottom there. You can just put /HTTP-admin, and it'll take you directly there if you don't want to go through the menus. Click on Manage and then the HTTP servers, and you'll be back into a place very similar to what I showed you a moment ago. The difference here is, of course, note that the document root is, in fact, the Zen server as delivered from our friends at Zen. So this is where you do a number of things. You set up your virtual host for the developers. You set up your virtual host for the test sites. You add applications. And this is where you do all your work. And again, I've pointed out where you say Edit Configuration File here. So, have you ever wondered how when you get a website from somebody out in the Internet, they give you a URL that says myinternetprovider.com, and then you have this tilde and your user profile name behind it for your specific website? Well, the way that works is if you look in the box that's highlighted yellow, you'll see there's a directory entry in there that says user directory /home */htdocs. What that does is that sets up every user who has a directory in home as a potential website that'll be hosted by this system. So all you need to do is add that code that's in that little box, press enter, and you'll have to restart the server for it to take effect. But restarting the server can be done right here from this panel. The blue box with the little round arrows on it will simply restart the server. And this is the Apache server now, not the Zen server. Restart the Apache server, and life will be pretty good. So Apache can also do virtual hosts. So one of the things that I do is I set up multiple sites on my system. So in this particular case, I've got all my virtual hosts are listening on port 80, and the first one is called mysername.com. So, and the second one is customermysite.com. Now, note that there's a couple of small differences there. One has a server name as www. whatever it happens to be, and the other one doesn't. Well, if you have the www.customer.mysite.com, like in the second example there, you need the server alias customer.mysite.com in order to make it so that you don't have to type in the www. If you don't do that, then www becomes part of the name, and if you get folks that just like to drop it when they put it into their browser, it won't work. So that's the secret behind that. So this particular Zen server is now serving up two websites, myservername.com and customer.mysite.com. So that's how you set up multiple sites off your one server. All right, let's consider some additional Apache directives. Why would the URL above there with PHPMyAdmin work, and the one below with just editor not work. Now, if you put the PHP suffix on editor, it would work. But why do you need the suffix in one and not in the other? The answer is really pretty simple. It's an alias directive. So there's an alias up there, PHPMyAdmin, pointed at user local Zen server PHPMyAdmin, and then the directory is later on in the config file. There's a directory statement for it that points everything there. But that alias statement is what makes the first one work and not the second one. If I had a second alias statement in there that said adminer, then the adminer would work and without the PHP. So one of the things that you want to do here, the lesson that you're taking away, is make sure you start spending some time with the Apache directives. Work management is the part of web serving that's oftentimes just completely forgotten. So Zend server runs in two distinct series of jobs. One is the QHTTP server, and the other one is the Zen server subsystem. Now, both of those tend to run in memory called Starbase. Starbase is the default memory that all systems use, and it runs fine there unless you've got a business system that's fairly busy. I like to get the HTTP server and the Zen server moved out of that memory because, quite honestly, Starbase is where most of the IBMi licensed program products live. And if you're fighting the licensed program products for memory and activity level and all the things that we use in work management, then quite literally the entire system starts to slow down. Not just the website, the whole shooting match. Now, MySQL has a subsystem as well, and so I usually will tinker with that. And one of the reasons memory management is critical for MySQL is that it tends to use the IFS a lot. And the IFS processes need enough memory to be able to function very quickly. So, and now that Zend has announced that they're going to take on the duties of managing MySQL, that's a good thing, and it ensures the longevity of the platform. So there's three portions of performance to consider. First is the Zen server settings. So the Zen server settings can affect how the Zen server runs very, very heavily. And it's beyond the scope of this presentation, but suffice it to say that there are some things inside the Zen server that can be done to make it really go very fast. There's other things that can be done to slow it down quite a bit, depending on your workload. So you need somebody who understands the Zen server to help you get that tuned up. The second thing is DB2 performance. Keep in mind that all web serving is, in fact, SQL-based access back to the database. So if you're going back to the database for anything, you are using SQL. And you need to have your index strategies and all of those things set up properly. You also need to know which engine you're using. The CQE is the old engine, the engine that was in V5R2, V5R3. They introduced the SQE, which is the new engine, at V5R4, and they use the SQE going forward. You want to make sure that you're not using the CQE as it's old and somewhat more slow. All the new developments for speed have been put into the SQE engine, so make sure you're using that. Again, getting you to the point where you're using that is beyond the scope of this presentation. In fact, it's good for nearly a week-long class that several different people teach. I personally like the IBM class that's taught up in Rochester, but suffice it to say that's a large topic. Then you've got the work management of several objects. You've got the Zen server subsystem. You've got the QHTTP server. And then if you're using ODBC or JDBC to access data, then you've got the two jobs that are listed down there. Those do all the SQL work. So the way to handle this is to change the HTTP server subsystem to have a second memory pool. So you change the shared pool and I'll show you this in some detail here, but basically what we do is change the share pool, add the pool to the subsystem, change the routing entry in the subsystem so it'll start using that memory, and then restart it. And then the Zen subsystem, you do the exact same series of changes. And then one of the things that I really suggest is that after you make the changes, you wait for a day or two just kind of watching it so that you can get your activity levels and memory right for the subsystem. Here's some of the changes we need to make. So in this particular case, I'm going to use SharePool 1 for the HTTP and Zen server jobs. So the first thing I did was put some memory in there. I put an activity level in there, and I went over into the text and I changed it so it would show what kind of jobs are going in there. Use F11 from the work share pool command to get to the text and fill it in. One of the more frustrating things that I run into at customer sites is they don't fill in this text showing me which subsystems are supposed to be running in which memory. Also, if you note, I changed the paging definition over to smart paging, which is start calc, as opposed to the fixed paging that the system was set up with to start with. That's done just so that it makes, again, a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but what it does is it allows the system to be very smart about the size and types of pages that it moves back and forth when it's doing paging or faulting. Here's the command that you use to actually change the subsystem description, QHTTP server, to add a second share pool 1, to its subsystem. And then you need to go in and change the routing entry. And again, the command for doing that is right below there. And it'll show you that there is only one routing entry in this subsystem. So you just need to point that at pool 2. So in the first command, you added pool 2, subsystem pool 2, which is SharePool 1. And then in the second command, you're saying use SharePool 1 for all my jobs. Then you restart the subsystem. You can restart the subsystem or the HTTP server quite easily by just using the command there at the bottom. So the next step is to get the Zen subsystem. So we do that the exact same way that we did for QHTTP server. And we link it up, and you can see that the subsystem description is, change subsystem command is very much the same as the one that we saw before. Note that there are 4 different routing entries that need to be done. Make sure you change all of the routing entries. The default is the one that will catch 99.9% of the jobs that come in there, but change them all just to be thorough. So enough on work management. If you have any questions on work management, there's a slide at the end of this presentation that has my contact information, and feel free to give me a call. Now let's talk about networking. Now here, this is going to get a little geeky, and there's too many words on this screen, but I had to get everything documented, and the next panel has a picture that will show you what we're up against here. So the question really becomes, how do I run securely a web server on my production box, which has an interface to my internal network as well as an interface to the world? So I'm serving up my Zen server applications to the world, and how do I do that without causing myself grief? Well, the way to do that is to have 2 separate local area networks, even if they're on the same physical cable. If you only have one physical Ethernet cable plugged in to your server, you can still pull this off. The first one is a network is 10.10.10.2. That particular one, if you recognize the subnet mask, notice that it's 255, 255, 255. Most of you will see a 0 at the end of that. In this case, I've used 252. What that does is it cuts the number of allowable host addresses down to just 2. So 1 and 2 are the only allowable host addresses at that point. So the web server is going to live in 2, and the firewall is going to live in 1. Now, the reason for doing that is that anybody who comes in with the appropriate network tools that wants to break away from what's going on here, they're just hamstrung. They're kept into that small network. It requires somebody who's extraordinarily advanced to get past it. Now, your corporate network is on 10.2.2, and note that the subnet mask there that I've used is 240 rather than 255. That gives me a total of 4,094 systems that could be on the network, as opposed to, if that were 255, there would only be a little over 250 hosts that would be allowed. So in your internal network, and 10.2 network, you can have as many things as you really need. Now, the one thing to keep in mind here is that the 10.10.10 network will not cross to the 10.2.2 network without a device called a router. Unless there is a router somewhere that will connect those two networks, the two sets of signals cannot cross. That's why this works on a single box. So let's take a picture of this. You'll see on the left-hand side in the green, I've got my IBMi and the 10.2.2 network, and I've got all of my workstations and my internal stuff going on over there. On that same cable, though, coming out of the firewall to the IBMi, I've also got another network configured that's 10.10.1, and then the IBMi instance is 10.10.2. Notice also that the firewall is doing what's called NAT, Network Address Translation is what that stands for. So it's taking the external address 65.30.51.110, translating that over to 10.10.1, and then handing that off from the firewall, and then handing that off to the IBMi at 10.10.10.2. Conversely, the other internet address that the company has is 65.30.51.115. That's the one that's used for all the internal networking and everything, so that if you're browsing out to the internet, the address that you're really using is the 115 address. So that's what keeps the two networks completely separate. Now, if you were a purist, you'd want two different firewalls there. And a lot of people do that. Firewalls are not all that terribly expensive. And if you're using Linux for your firewall, they're free. So you can set it up various different ways, but this is the way that I see a lot of people set it up. Now, one of the other things that you want to do is make sure that only the traffic you want to come into your web server is just HTTP. You don't want to allow somebody in there that can do other things. So here's how you do that. First off, and this requires system-I navigate. IP policies is one of the things that hasn't been put into Systems Director Navigator just yet. So under networking, you'll find IP policies, and if you right-click on that, you can then get into the dialog that's shown there where you can create new packet file, packet rules file, or copy one, or play around with them. So let's set some premise up here. The first three statements that need to be in my packet interface file set the addresses. So my internal IP address for the web server is 10.10.1. It's trusted. The production address is 10.2.2, which is also trusted, but then it sends the external address is 65.30.51.110, and we set that as a border address. Now, those of you who have seen IP tables in Linux, you'll start to say, well, yeah, this looks awful familiar. And the answer to your question is, yeah, it's very, very similar to IP tables in Linux. There are some differences in the scripting, but it's very, very similar. So now the next step, now that we've set our addresses, and the reason that we've done that is now we can use the names, my internal IP address or my prod IP address, etc., rather than the numbers in all of the balance of the commands. So now that I've got that done, I can set my filter setup. So the first filter that I set up on my internal IP address sets a filter, and what it's going to do is allow anything outbound and stop, but only allow port 80 inbound. So the first one allows anything out. The second one, the second filter set, only allows destination port 80, in other words, inbound only to port 80. And the way you can tell that is in the direction statement there, one says outbound, one says inbound. So outbound, anything goes. inbound only on port 80. So the system itself, the IBMi, will act kind of like a pseudo firewall and stop anything that's coming into that internal IP address except for port 80. You can also assign line names to interface names. So if I had two line descriptions, one called my web line and my ETH line, if in the line configurations on your system that's what you called them, you can set one to the internal interface and one to the external interface. So now I have both of them. And then this next step here, what I'm going to do is show you how now we've got port 80 only allowed to come in, but what happens if there's anything going on with FTP? So using the packet filters, what I'm going to do is show you how now to block FTP in or out, except from your own workstation. So we set the service control and the data ports, which is 20 and 21. Next step is to deny outbound anything on FTP control, except for, notice that set allow me FTP outbound off of the source address 10.2.2.110. And I just picked that at random. I decided that was my source address. Notice that the filter interface down on the bottom there, I set up my ETH line to allow me FTP. So you can see that we're using some names here in these rules rather than IP addresses. So what's happened once you put these 3 or 4 or 5 statements in there is you've allowed yourself to FTP from your workstation out, but you've denied all other FTP activity altogether. That's one of the secrets of the web packet filter in the IBMi. It's an extremely powerful way to manage whether or not things can come in or go out of your server. And by using a combination of work management and object-oriented authority on your objects, and by using the packet filter, we can very clearly and very nicely, securely set up an internal website and an external website and keep them from mixing. So you can safely put your Zen server instance out on the world without having anybody get to it. So, last 45 minutes we've talked about a lot of stuff. And I ran through some pretty techno-geek stuff in a fairly big hurry. To recap, we made sure that we had all the parts necessary to run the Apache server, have Java when necessary, and run the Zen server. We set up an individual developer's website by creating home directories in their own directories and then moving the appropriate files into their directories and setting security so that they were the only ones that could get to it. We did some work management so that the servers were all moved into memory and whatnot that are used so that it makes them efficient. This way, other things going on in the system cannot interfere with your web serving. Then we put some pretty heavy security on the network. Now I might add that just using what I presented here is probably not in total sufficient enough to do the job, but it gives you a very good idea about the various different steps that you need to take care of to get a website done. If you came to me and you said, Jim, I'd really like you to set up my website. I've got the Zen server up and running. I've got a website that I really want to put out to the world. I want to set up developer websites so that they can do their development, and then we can go through standard change control to put it in production. How long would that take? Somebody who knows what they're doing, has the skills necessary in work management and the skills necessary in a networking environment, it's going to take them about 2, maybe 3 days to get all of this stuff set up and then monitor it long enough to make sure that there aren't any problems. You could probably do the setup in half a day, but that doesn't allow you for any time to manage the workloads and make sure that everything is running. So at this point, aside aside from the one question that we had about starting the HTTP instances, I haven't seen any more come up. If you have any questions, please toss them up. In the meantime, this is where you can find me at my office in New Berlin, Wisconsin. New Berlin is just outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And there's the phone number to get a hold of me. And, of course, my email address. You're probably best off to try and get a hold of me via email. I do tend to see that more quickly than I do the phone. Oh, here's a question. Do you recommend to have the PHP and RPG in the same virtual server? Absolutely. Calling RPG from PHP is a very valid thing to do. It works extremely well. The Zen server has constructs in there that allow you to access all your IBMi objects. One of them that you can get at pretty easily is the data queues, which I use extensively, I might add, because it's a wonderful way to communicate between processes. So absolutely, you can do that very well. He goes on to ask if they execute RPG CGI on the web. And again, yes, you can do that both successfully on the same server. What you will have, however, is a number more threads that you need to be concerned with. So watch your work management to make sure that your activity level and memory is sufficiently high inside the server that you don't starve it. So any other questions? It says, meaning having another small i5 server in the DMZ of the firewall. Well, if you have another system, either an LPAR, which is my favorite way to do it, and you can do a hosted LPAR at 6.1 or 7.1, you could put up a small i server as an LPAR and put that in the DMZ of the firewall if you'd like. That's certainly one way to do it. One of the reasons that I don't show that here is because a number of people just don't want to deal with the complexity of doing LPAR, but certainly that is an excellent way to do it. A lot of people do, and it eliminates some of the security issues that you run into, but you still have to set up the packet filter so that as you're moving data back and forth between the two LPARs, only the data from those two instances can get back and forth. You don't want any interlopers to be able to get into that network. I'll, again, thank you for your time and effort and attendance. We'll turn it back over to the Zen folks, and I thank you very much. Have a good day.
Hi, everyone. This is Debbie from Zen. Thank you very much for attending the session today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at debbie.o@zen.com, and I'll be happy to make sure you get the information needed. Thanks again for attending, and we'll see you at our next webinar.